to Week 8 Forum, guys. Thanks for coming along. I noticed some of you probably haven't been to forums before, so a brief overview of what forums are might be useful for you. So every week we have a speaker come and talk about a topic of interest that in some way is relevant to Christianity or faith, and talk about that interaction and that relationship. Maybe it's a challenging relationship, maybe people think it's controversial, or it isn't quite compatible, or maybe there's just like some ethical issue at play there. We also get people to come and talk about how Christianity relates to career choices and vocation and a whole host of other things. This semester we've tried to give each faculty their own forum theme, so that's what has happened so far. This week's is the science faculties, so it's going to be speaking specifically on the topic of how Christianity led to science by CU's own Rob Miller, who was unfortunately somewhat, I'm not sure what the measurement is, some degree of sick. So,
We always are. Higher degree than normal.
We are, okay, cool. So we're super grateful to Rob for coming in today, even though he's sick. So hopefully this is a topic that is kind of broad enough to interest different people, even if you're not in science. Although it's definitely obviously applicable to science and biomed. I think it's also broad enough that we can think about it, even if you're in a different faculty, you won't be super bored or it won't be relevant for you. Alright, so without further ado, I'll let Rob get started.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's great to be with you and great to be able to talk on this topic. And the topic that I chose for myself is why Christianity led to science. If that's a different question to how, I'm not sure. I think it maybe is just slightly different. Anyway,
that's me, sorry.
Hold me accountable for speaking about why Christianity led to science. Okay, so look, this is in some ways an outrageous claim. I think it's a reasonable claim. What are we actually talking about here? When I talk about science, I'm using that as just shorthand for the scientific method, that combination of theorising and experimenting, theory plus empirical observation, and the associated concepts that you may well be familiar with going with that, repeatability, falsification, and so on. So when I say science, I mean the scientific method. And I'm assuming that the scientific method has arisen only once in human history, and that was in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th centuries. Science arose only once in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th centuries. And here's the basic argument, that this was because, rather than despite, the fact that Europe had been substantially Christian for around about 1,000 years. Because, rather than despite, different regions of Europe had been Christian for longer than that, some for less, say 600 or 700 years. Of course, we can quibble about the extent to which Christianity had taken hold in Europe, but nevertheless, the scientific method is a product of a region that was substantially Christian. And I want to show why that would be. To approach this issue rightly, I think we do need to lay aside the idea that the development of science or the scientific method was inevitable in any way. If you think it's inevitable, I think that's going to cloud the question in all kinds of ways. Don't know if you've ever played the game Civilization. Do you know the computer game Civilization, which is lots of fun, I think. One of the things in that game, in its various iterations, is, and there are it happens differently in different versions of the game, but really, basically, there's a technology track, and everyone follows it. Right? In fact, you know where it's heading. Where it's ultimately heading, not ultimately, but where it's heading is towards the development of the scientific method, and then the things that follow from that. And the makers of the game either can't conceive of, or just thought it's just too hard to imagine any other kind of developments outside of what actually historically happened. But also that really everyone is on the track. And actually it doesn't matter which religion you choose or develop or follow, or which philosophies or forms of government and so on. It doesn't matter what you choose in any of those areas, you still end up developing the scientific method. And I think, no, actually, we need to imagine that it could be otherwise than that. And in fact, we want to say that in every other case, it was otherwise. That the choices that various civilizations made actually did not lead to the scientific method being developed, and that is connected with those choices. So I think, we do need to imagine that other worldviews and philosophies and religions might lead in other directions, and need to consider that whether under other worldviews science would be thought of as possible or likely or even desirable. So just in answering this question, I want to take two angles. The first of all, the kind of worldview angle, the theology and worldview angle, and then secondly, the historical angle, and just deal with each of those briefly. So let me just talk about the Christian worldview, or rather the Judeo-Christian worldview, I think we need to say at this stage, the Judeo-Christian worldview. That is the worldview reflected in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, grounded especially in Genesis chapter 1 in the Bible, but in other biblical texts as well. And let me just mention some basic aspects of that worldview, may be familiar to you. First of all, that the physical world or the universe is real and good. The physical world was brought into being by God. The world is not eternal, but had a beginning. Some beliefs about God, that God is eternal and personal, uncreated, and having a satiety, that is self-existence. That God is distinct from the world, but dynamically related to the world. Some beliefs about human beings, that human beings were made in the image of God, that human beings have been given the task or mandate to rule the world and exercise dominion over it, to fill it and subdue it as stewards of the world and as vice-regents of God. That human beings are both physical and spiritual beings, and that both aspects are real and good and important. Further, that God made the world by his wisdom and through his word. The Greek word, logos, is also the word for reason or rationality. And therefore, wisdom and reason of God is embedded in the world and, in principle, are able to be discovered. The world is deliberately ordered by God, and complexity and distinctiveness and variety are deliberate and good things. God's creation reveals God, his glory, power, wisdom, and strength. Not everything is revealed about God, but much is revealed about God. The knowledge of God revealed in the world is not exhaustive, but it's real knowledge. A couple more. History has a direction and goal. That is, history is essentially linear, not cyclical. And finally, human discoveries are just that the technologies that human beings possessed were developed by human beings, rather than being gifts from or stolen from the gods. Well, I just want to point out that if you overturn or reject one or more of these basic ideas, then the development of science becomes much less likely. So let me give you some examples. If the physical world is not ultimately real, then there would be no reason to do science. Real knowledge would come through an inward turn towards meditation and contemplation to free oneself from the illusion of the world, which only leads to suffering. So there's a substantial part of humanity which historically has believed that the physical world is ultimately illusory. And to hold that view, I think, makes the development of science extremely unlikely. Another example, if the world of matter is eternal and uncreated, then we have no reason to think it orderly and rational. And so, for example, in Neoplatonic philosophy, which was the dominant in Greek civilization over several centuries regarded matter as unruly and perhaps even the evil creation of a lesser god. So they believed matter was unruly, if not actually evil. And therefore the real action was in talking about the mind and the world of the forms. And so reason was really where it was at, rationality, but not empiricism. There was no real interest in the physical world. And so following Plato, Socrates and Plato, this was the dominant Greek view and made the development of science unlikely. Human beings were made to rule, but what if they were just made to serve the gods? Many versions of polytheism held that human beings were made in order to be servants of the gods and to feed them. It seems unlikely within that framework that science would develop compared to the view that human beings were made in order to rule the world. Or what about this one? The world is distinct from God. That's the Judeo-Christian belief. But what if you understood the world as somehow divine? That there was no distinction between God and the world? Well, then what you would do essentially towards the world would be to worship it rather than investigate it. And this is essentially the animistic worldview, or the polytheistic worldview as well. And so, for example, in many worldviews, the sun and moon and stars were objects of worship. But according to the Christian worldview, and as described in Genesis, they were just lights or lamps. They were not divine beings, and therefore open to investigation. Or if you believe that history was not linear but cyclical, then you would not expect really there to be any accumulated knowledge and progress. The same knowledge would be gained and lost again and again and again, and you would have no reason to think there would be a development of human knowledge. So I think the Judeo-Christian worldview provided a framework in which science was possible and desirable, not merely allowable, but desirable and possible. There was a positive view of involvement in the world. There was a positive view of the powers of human reason, because humans were made in the image of God who made the world, and also in the powers of observation. That is, that there was reason to endorse and develop both rationality and empiricism. And there was a positive view of the world, but a desacralized view of the world, of the material world. That is, the world was not thought of as sacred or divine, and neither was it thought of as evil. So there was, Christianity had a kind of in-between position, which made, I think, science much more likely. Okay, so that's one part of the argument from worldview, and the way in which other worldviews do not lend themselves nearly so much to the development of the scientific method. What about history and the key kind of historical developments behind the emergence of science? What were those developments in medieval Europe that led to science in the full sense? Well, let me just point out three of them: the university, scholasticism, and natural theology. If you know anything about the history of the universities, you will know that they are surprisingly early, according to some views of intellectual history. University of Bologna, 1080. University of Paris, 1160 or so. Oxford, 1167. Cambridge, 1209. Salamanca, 1218. Padua, 1222. Naples, 1224, and so on. And all of these based really on earlier schools. There were 29 universities in Europe by 1400, and a further 28 were founded in the next 100 years, so that by 1500 there were 50 plus universities in Europe. In terms of their spread, in terms of their modern locations, they existed in Italy, France, England, Spain, Portugal, Czech, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Germany, Albania, Croatia, Scotland, Belgium, Switzerland, Slovakia, Denmark and Sweden. There were 3 universities in tiny Scotland by the year 1500. It was a continent-wide community of scholars speaking a common language, Latin, mutually recognising each other's degrees, and with a high incidence of movement and interchange of people and ideas. So, for example, Copernicus, who's sometimes pictured as working out in the boondocks on his own at the University of Krakow, studied in several Italian universities, and his work shows a knowledge of a wide variety of thinkers coming before him, even though he doesn't acknowledge them. People were only able to enter these universities having studied grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. That was what they assumed that people had done in school before they went to the university. And so you had here quite an extraordinary development and rapid in that time of a community of learning, 50 universities by 1500. And one writer called the universities the darling and spoilt child of the medieval world. That is, church and state in the medieval world lavished resources on the universities. This was not something that happened in opposition to the prevailing culture, but was very much a product of it. Secondly, scholasticism. And this was the major intellectual movement within the universities at this time. It was marked by a concern for precision in language and argument and the making of fine distinctions. There was the rediscovery, or not so much rediscovery, but the translation of Aristotle into Latin enabled wide discussion of Aristotle's works. And by the 1200s, Aristotle was not just being understood, but critiqued, and those elements of Aristotle's thinking which were unhelpful in the development of science were ultimately able to be critiqued and rejected, and those elements of his thought that were helpful were able to be identified and continued. In particular, scholasticism was helpful in regard to the issue of causation, and this is something where they built on and modified Aristotle in various ways. And you might remember that Aristotle identified the various kinds of causes, and what the scholastics did was that they particularly applied this idea to the study of nature, and they said that there were primary causes and secondary causes, and that God could be identified as a primary cause, but that he might use and work through secondary causes. And this idea of secondary causation was crucial in allowing people to work on, well, what are the efficient causes of certain phenomena, and to say, without kind of saying, having to argue about whether it was God or not. They really overcame the idea of the God of the gaps very early on, around about in the 1200s. So let me give you some example here. Albertus Magnus, who I think was the Chancellor of the University of Paris, around 1200, in studying nature, he said, "We have not to inquire how God, the Creator, may, as he freely wills, use his creatures to work miracles and thereby show forth his power. We have rather to inquire what nature, with its immanent causes, can naturally bring to pass." So there's a distinction between God's direct action and God working through secondary causes, and that basically you could have a field of study which was about the secondary causes without being in any way impious or irreligious. A couple of other examples. Thomas Aquinas, writing again in the 1200s, "Nature is nothing but the plan of some art, namely a divine one, put into things themselves, by which those things move towards a concrete end, as if the man who builds a ship could give to the pieces of wood that they would move by themselves to produce the form of the ship." And you can hear there in those kind of ideas the possibility of studying the secondary or immanent causes. And this led in turn to the development of natural theology or natural philosophy as a key part of the curriculum of the medieval universities. And natural theology or natural philosophy was distinguished from the theology of reason or philosophy itself, that is, abstract thought. And on the other hand, theology based on revelation, biblical theology. Natural theology was an investigation into the natural world, and that this investigation into the natural world was regarded as a branch of theology. One of the pictures that they used to talk about this was the idea of two books. There are two books that revealed God, the Bible on one hand, the subject of revealed theology, and nature on the other hand, the second book, the subject of natural theology. And that both these books would reveal truths about God, and because there was only one God and one truth, ultimately those truths would be compatible, and that therefore Christians had nothing to fear from reading the book of nature and working from it. So they understood what they were doing in terms of theorising as thinking God's thoughts after him. And that the work to reveal the true nature of things and understand material causes was not anti-God, but actually revealed the glory of God. There was an increasing description in this time of nature and natural phenomena in mathematical terms, and comparison of natural phenomena to machines. The use of mechanical analogies in describing nature, and using the word machine with regard to nature became commonplace in this time. And so the idea of natural laws arose, and they really didn't mean this in an almost literal way, that these things were laws laid down by God, who they knew from Revelation to be a lawgiver, and who underwrote and guaranteed their consistency and reliability. They also came to believe that mathematical truths were products of the mind of God. So it was in this, within this framework of the study of natural theology and philosophy that the practice of the scientific method emerged from around 1550 onwards, and which it was essentially a development of. Particularly the more deliberate application of experimentation in the empirical side of the theory and observation side of things. And so it's possible to show, I think, that the first practice of science was essentially a Christian enterprise. One author, Rodney Stark, in his book For the Glory of God, Stark is not a Christian himself. The book's called For the Glory of God, How Monotheism Led to Reformation, Science, Witch Hunts, and the End of Slavery. Princeton University Press, 2003. It's a great read. In this chapter on the development of science, he identified 52 scientific stars from 1543 to 1680, basically the period between Copernicus publishing on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres and Newton's Principia. And he found, of the 52, 26 of them were Protestant and 26 of them were Roman Catholic, so I didn't find a particular difference there. From what we know of them, from their writings, 32 of them he classifies as devout, 18 as conventional in their religious opinions, and 2 of them as skeptics, including one of them, Edmund Halley, who he says was probably atheist. So predominantly the practice of the scientific method was developed and initially used by people he describes as devout or at least religiously conventional. As we read the writings of some of those key figures, we see them using the same language and approach developed in natural theology for what they understood themselves to be doing. So, for example, Kepler, Johannes Kepler, the reason why the mathematicals are the cause of natural things is that God the Creator had mathematicals with him as archetypes from eternity in their simplest divine state of abstraction. So he understood what he's doing as uncovering the plan or mind of God in the natural world as he applied the scientific method to it. Well, if this is true, why is it that people believe the exact opposite? That is, that there is an inherent conflict between science and Christianity, the conflict thesis, and that this development and advance of science required a constant fight against superstition and religious dogma. Well, we haven't really got time to go into that, but I'll just mention that I think that it's mainly the product of some key figures in the Enlightenment, much later, who were not themselves by and large scientists, people like Voltaire, Rousseau, the historian Edward Gibbon. A couple of very key sort of works from the late 19th century, which raised this thesis. You may have heard of them. John William Draper's book, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874. And then the 2-volume work by a guy called A.D. White, The History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom, 1896. Quite a number of myths have been passed on from that kind of period. In the recent period, you might identify people like Carl Sagan and various figures of the new atheism as people who've also passed on myths supporting this kind of conflict thesis. So, for example, Christopher Hitchens reported that Christians tried to ban the number 0. And there was an article, I think, in New Scientist magazine about the number 0 called The Number They Tried to Ban. Not even the article itself actually shows any evidence that this was true, but it's a belief that has been passed on uncritically, without scepticism, we might say, by people like Hitchens. What about the one about how the Pope tried to excommunicate Halley's Comet? This is mentioned by Sagan in his book Comet, 1997. It's simply not true, but it doesn't stop him from passing this on. One of the key ways of kind of making this case has been to characterise ages in different ways. So to call the medieval period the Dark Ages, minimise and ignore its achievements, speak of a scientific revolution as if science just appeared suddenly out of nowhere and had nothing to do with the medieval period, speak of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment as opposed to the Dark Ages and the medieval period. Other things have actually been more accidental than that. For example, Newton's writings on theology, which amount to over 1 million words, were really not known or published in any form until the mid-20th century. That is, all the papers that he left were essentially ignored or hidden or untranslated for various reasons for many years. And it was only much later that it's become clear that he was someone deeply interested in theological questions and personally devout. Okay, so I think that this is possible to make a case for why it is that Christianity led to science, not in an inevitable sense, but created the conditions where it was most likely to emerge. And I do think that Christianity still offers actually the best framework for doing science. Partly this is because science doesn't answer questions of primary causation and does not actually concern itself with the purpose or aim of anything. And so Christianity provides a framework where people can talk about the purpose or aim of the natural world as well as its mechanisms. Secondly, Christianity provides a framework which resists the depersonalisation of human beings. That is, by affirming that human beings have a spiritual as well as a physical dimension, Christianity is well placed to resist the various kinds of determinism which some kinds of science might actually try to impose upon our thinking about human beings. And thirdly, Christianity provides an ethical framework for science because it helps us to see that what can be done is not necessarily what should be done, and so prevents the, or to some extent mitigates against the misuse of science. All right. Maybe, would you just like to talk amongst yourself for a couple of minutes, and then we might have time for questions. Let's do that. I wonder, first of all, if anyone would like to ask any kind of questions of clarification, if I've been perhaps unclear or... Yeah.
Could you clarify, near the end of your talk, you mentioned determinism.
Yes.
In what sense do you mean determinism?
Oh, well, I think that there are various kinds of determinism that are sometimes applied to human beings in, say, the different sciences like, say, cognitive psychology, that free will is an illusion. That would be a kind of determinism with regard to, say, you know, that to understand the human mind merely in terms of physical processes, which, and since the same causes always follow the same effects, you know, therefore you have no essential control over what you think. That would be a determinism, and I think there are various versions of that in, say, the social sciences, in history studies, and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
You could also find determinism in other sciences in all the way.
Beg pardon?
You could find determinism in like even the physical sciences.
Yes.
And like you find the saying, I think one of my subjects this semester we looked at the Laplacian dream, which is by Laplace, an 18th century mathematician, is that you could have an equation, you have all your particles, and you could predict the past, the future, the present.
Yes.
You could do that, and that's what the determinism they're going for, that you can determine everything. The first one we got to is that's his dream's dead.
Yeah. And it's not. It wouldn't just be, you know, against every kind of determinism. But it would just simply be wanting to say that we understand that human beings are in some sense special and exempt for various reasons. Yeah. And so we'd be resistant to those kinds of determinism which were about human choice and behaviour.
Following up, why is the Bible resistant to that sort of thing? Surely, as we talk about God understanding, knowing that what we perceive as being the future ahead of us, surely that precludes any possibility of actually that happening in any different way to the way that he understands to happen. Whereas, so while we perceive having choice and free will and stuff, on an absolute level, if we consider God there, the Bible should be fundamentally deterministic.
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and there's been a lot of ink spilt on that. And I'm really, you know, be happy to kind of chew it over, but it's going well outside our topic. But yes, there are all kinds of issues to do with free will and determinism that Christians have to wrestle with. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that a biblical worldview would make us resistant to various determinisms applied to human beings and human behaviour. So I'm trying to make just a more modest kind of claim to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to go back just to the main kind of idea and just any questions just about that? So the two things that I talked about were the theology and worldview background, and then some of the specific historical developments.
For the first thing you said there, towards the start you said how creation reveals qualities of God.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say it reveals God's grace?
No, I think I probably, perhaps, yes. And I mean, you know, the answer to the question like that is always, it depends what you mean by grace. And, possibly. But, I mean, the basic assertion was just that one could find out things about God from looking at the natural order, So just exactly what those things are, probably not so important for for this discussion.
Yeah.
But certainly, it was not claimed that exhaustive knowledge of God, or that everything that might usefully be known about God, could be known from the second book. That probably, if there were two books, there was a reason for that. Yeah.
At the start, you talked about how Christianity was a good foundation for science because it was able to separate nature from God.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like investigating secondary causes. From my understanding, like it wasn't like outside of Christianity, it wasn't like universal that people saw the stars and stuff as gods. It was quite common for like people to see stars and sun and moon as kind of messengers from God, like do astrology, look for some information.
Yeah.
But like even in that sort of framework, I think that would be very possible for science to grow in, because you want to find out the patterns of the stars and stuff so you can see and possibly work out what are the gods trying to say to us through this.
Yeah.
Like that's separation as well.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's impossible, just that it becomes less likely. But certainly there are different versions of the understanding of the relationship between the divine and the physical world. Yeah, and there are all kinds of variations. And so so animism is not the same as polytheism, and that's not the same as pantheism or panentheism. The view that everything is divine, or that God is in everything but could be distinguished. Like there are all kinds of shades of belief there. Yeah, and so I have generalised, but I think the generalisation holds. But yeah, that there are varieties of those views which might lend themselves more to science than others. Yeah.
So, not a historian, so going from what I can recall.
Yeah.
From memory, whenever I've been looking at the ancient Greek philosophers and so on and so forth, a lot of what they did tended to lead into a natural philosophy of essentially your scientific method, your hypothesis, your test, your conclusion.
Yeah.
So surely that's a far more compelling foundation for the idea of scientific method developing outside of Christianity.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting and it's complicated. It really depends on which Greek thinker you're talking about. I will try and finish. There were various blocks. I think, look, Aristotle was probably the most helpful, but there were some significant aspects of his thought that actually had to be discarded before medieval Christianity could move forward in this area. So, but part of the point is that, in fact, Aristotle's thinking was not taken up as the majority kind of view in subsequent centuries. That Greek culture became Neoplatonic, and that so that even the positive signs there in Aristotle, not really a full-blown empiricism, but at least tendency in that direction, was rejected in favour of a Neoplatonic view, which saw the investigation of matter as essentially a waste of time.
So it's sort of more thinking of Christianity more as a base for a widespread acceptance of science and that method.
Yeah. So I'm not. So I'm not saying that the roots are exclusively Christian, nor that the development was, every aspect of the development was inherently Christian or anything like that, but that it was likely, and then that in fact that is actually what happened. Yeah. All right. Well, we need to stop there. Happy to keep talking. I'll hand back to Rosemary. Thanks.
We might I'll just make some announcements, and then if you want to keep talking to Rob, I'm sure he's happy to do that. Cool. So thanks for coming to this week's forum. If you do want to keep talking, please feel free to hang around for a little bit until we get kicked out of the room, or not. No, I can't see anyone so far. So we have this every week, and usually this room or the room next to it. So next week is going to be the Music Faculty Groups Forum. We're having David Chiswell, who you might know is married to Lexi Chiswell, if you guys know her. I call my phone just over the notes. So he's going to be coming and speaking on music, covering a few different angles, but talking about issues like, at what point does worship music sort of become just worship of music and not just worship of God and that kind of thing? Can you be a Christian pop artist without falling into the trap of, idolatry and being worshipped for kind of who you are, not what you're doing? Is it possible to retain focus on God whilst enjoying music, or does it always become corrupted in some way? Although it's aimed again at music faculty, we hope that this is a broad enough topic for anyone who listens to music at any time with any slight Christian bent. Hopefully, is at least most of you. I guess if you're attending like a CU event, chances are you've heard like a hymn or two in your life. And if you haven't, maybe come along and hear what Dave has to say about that. So yeah, that will be next week. And then the following 2 weeks after that, we're having kind of a double billing of biomed themed talks. So the first week 10, we're having Andy Prideaux talking about suffering. So he's going to be speaking a little bit more of a theological bent. Some of you guys might know he's been writing a lot on Job recently. So he's going to be tackling it from a little bit more of a theological angle. And then the following week 11, Dr. Justin Denham will be coming in. Some of you might remember him from previous years. He is a specialist in disease. So he's going to be coming and speaking about suffering from more of a particular medical angle, but also bringing in a Christian lens to that medical angle, if that makes sense. So that should be really good. 2 weeks of different looks at the same issue of suffering and how we deal with that in a Christian context. And then our final week 12, we'll have Helen Bell over here speaking on the topic of rest. So you might think it's a little bit of an ironic topic for week 12, which is gearing up to swap back and all that. But we hope that it is helpful and not just confusing. So
it may be very helpful, all right? Depends on where you're at.
So that's what we're looking at for the rest of the semester. We hope you guys can come along to any of those. If you want more information, there'll be Facebook events up. We have a Facebook page for forums called MUCU Forums. Will also get shared through the main CU page and through the faculty groups that their forum is for. So hopefully you can find it there. Let me know if you can't. And thanks for coming, guys. But if you do want to stick around, please stick around.